The dust of San Pedro tasted of grit and failed prayers. It settled on everything: the warped boards of the mercantile, the sweat-stained felt of a cattleman's hat, the silent lips of the Apache man who stood in the shade of the livery stable. Ben's hands, calloused from mending tack and calming wild stock, were still. He watched the noon stagecoach rattle down the main street, a plume of ochre dust trailing it like a shroud. He was in town for grain and leather polish, simple errands that offered a brief reprieve from the sprawling, soulless ranch of Silas Kane. The coach groaned to a halt before the assayer's office. A few passengers disembarked, shielding their eyes against the sun's hammered glare. A woman in a fine dress, her face pale with exhaustion, clutched the hand of her young son. A prospector, bearded and smelling of sour hope, squinted at the town as if measuring its worth in ounces. It was a scene as old as the territory itself, a constant churn of arrivals and departures. Ben was about to turn back toward the mercantile when the rhythm of the day shattered. They came from the alleys, 4 riders moving with a fluid, predatory grace. They wore dusters that concealed their forms and bandanas that hid their faces, but there was nothing common about their leader. He sat his black stallion not like a common outlaw, but like a general surveying a battlefield. He was tall and lean, and when he pulled down his bandana, his face was not the brutish mask of a highwayman. It was sharp, intelligent, and marked by a chilling calm. This was Silas Kane. He didn't shout. His voice, when it came, was articulate and cold, cutting through the sudden, terrified silence of the street. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kane announced, his tone deceptively mild, "a temporary tax is being levied on all travelers. Please consider it a contribution to the vigorous economic expansion of this valley. Your cooperation will ensure a swift and painless transaction." His men were already moving, their pistols drawn. They were efficient, their movements practiced. One disarmed the shotgun guard before he could even raise his weapon. Another herded the passengers against the wall of the assayer's office. Fear was a physical thing, a stink of sweat and choked-back cries that soured the air. Ben remained in the shadows of the livery, his body tensing, every instinct screaming at him to either fight or flee. But he was one man unarmed, save for a skinning knife at his belt. To act was to die. Kane dismounted, his polished boots sinking into the thick dust. He moved among the petrified passengers, not with the frantic greed of a thief, but with the detached air of a collector. He ignored rings and watches, his gaze sweeping over the small personal effects. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, finally settled on the woman in the fine dress. She was trying to hide her son behind her skirts, her body trembling. In her hand, she clutched a silver locket on a delicate chain. That, Kane said, his voice dropping to an almost intimate whisper. He extended a gloved hand. "If you please." The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It was my mother's," she pleaded. "It's all I have of her." "Every object has a story," Kane replied, his patience wearing thin. A flicker of something dark and ancient crossed his features. "I am merely starting a new chapter for this one." He gestured with his chin, and one of his men stepped forward, jamming the barrel of his pistol into the little boy's side. The child let out a terrified whimper. The woman's resolve crumbled. With a sob, she held out the locket. From his vantage point, Ben's breath caught in his throat. The sun glinted off the silver, and for a heart-stopping second, he saw it clearly. It wasn't just a locket. It was chased with the intricate design of a desert primrose, its petals unfurling around a small inset turquoise stone. The world around Ben dissolved into a roaring tunnel of memory. He was no longer in the dusty street of San Pedro. He was standing by a creek bed, the scent of rain on the air, watching the light catch on an identical locket resting against the collarbone of his wife, Nalin. Her name meant gentle friend, and she had been the anchor of his soul. He remembered the feel of the silver warmed by her skin as he fastened it around her neck on the day of their bonding. It had been her mother's and her mother's before, that a chain of memory and love passed through generations of his people. The memory was shattered by the sharp crack of a gunshot. The prospector had made a foolish move, reaching for a hidden pistol. One of Kane's men shot him without a word, the sound unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. The woman with the locket screamed. Kane didn't even flinch. He pocketed the locket, his movements unhurried. As I said, he stated, his voice flat, cooperation ensures a painless transaction. This man chose pain. He mounted his horse, his gaze sweeping the street one last time. For a moment his eyes seemed to pass over the shadows where Ben stood, but they registered nothing. To Silas Kane, an Apache in a stable was no different from a post or a barrel. He was invisible. The riders galloped away, leaving the town in a cloud of dust and horror. The dead prospector lay in the street, a dark stain spreading beneath him. People emerged slowly from their hiding places, their faces ashen. Ben remained frozen, his hand clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. The image of the locket was burned into his mind. It couldn't be. Nolan and their son had been lost 5 years ago, caught in a cavalry raid that had swept through their winter camp, a raid that had been a mistake, a tragic response to false reports of an Apache uprising. He had found their bodies, but the locket had been gone, ripped from her neck in the chaos. He had believed it lost forever, buried in the mud and blood of that terrible day. Now to see it here in the hands of a man like Silas Kane, it was impossible. A coincidence. There could be 2 lockets made with the same design. But the knot of ice in his stomach told him otherwise. It was a cold, hard certainty that defied logic. The robbery was no longer just a brutal act of violence he had witnessed. It was a personal desecration. The man who had just terrorized San Pedro, and the man who owned the land Ben worked, and the man who held the debts of half the valley, was now tangled in the deepest wound of Ben's past. The mystery of Silas Kane was no longer about his insatiable greed for land. It was about a silver locket shaped like a desert primrose and the ghost it had resurrected. Ben's quiet, invisible life had just ended. The path ahead was no longer one of silent endurance. It was a path that led directly to Kane, and Ben knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he would have to walk it to its bitter end. The Carter wagon was a skeleton held together by rust and stubbornness. It rattled into the yard of the Circle K ranch 2 days later, carrying what little remained of the Carter family's pride. Kate Carter sat beside her mother, holding the reins with hands that were raw from farm work, but steady with resolve. Behind them in the wagon bed was a single trunk containing their worldly possessions. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving behind acres of sun-baked dust, a failing well, and a ledger signed in Silas Kane's elegant, spidery ink. The debt had grown like a malignant tumor, the interest compounding with a cruelty that defied the seasons. With her mother's lungs growing weaker with each passing year, Kate had been left with only one bargain to make. She had written to Mr. Kane offering to work off the debt in his household. His reply had been swift and formal, accepting her terms. As they approached the main house, a sprawling adobe structure that seemed to have grown out of the earth itself, imposing and permanent, Kate felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was the man who had terrorized San Pedro, the man the town now whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. She had told herself it was just work, a simple transaction of labor for debt. But the stories of the robbery of the man killed in the street had painted a far more menacing picture. Silas Kane stood on the porch, not with a foreman's bark or a rancher's rugged welcome, but with the quiet poise of a landed gentleman. He was dressed in a tailored suit, a silver-headed cane resting lightly in his hand. His bruised face from some unknown scuffle had been replaced by a faint, fading discoloration around one eye. but it did little to diminish his aura of absolute control. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice as smooth and cool as Riverstone. "And Mrs. Carter, welcome to the Circle K. I trust your journey was not too arduous." His politeness was more unnerving than any threat. Kate helped her mother down from the wagon, the older woman's breathing shallow and ragged. "Thank you for seeing us, Mr. Kane," Kate said, keeping her voice even. "Nonsense. It is my Christian duty to offer succor to those in need." Kane replied, his eyes briefly flicking over Kate's worn calico dress. It was a look of appraisal, cold and detached, as if he were judging livestock. "The debt will be reduced with every week of service. You will find that I am a man of my word." He gestured for a foreman to deal with the wagon, and then turned to a silent figure who had emerged from the shadows of the nearby barn. It was the Apache hand she had seen in town, the one people avoided. He was tall and lean, his face a mask of stoic neutrality, but his dark eyes missed nothing. "Ben Kane," said the name, sounding foreign and clipped on his tongue. "Take Miss Carter. Show her the stables. Her duties will begin there. Ensure she is useful." The Apache, Ben, met Kate's gaze for a fleeting moment. There was no welcome in his eyes, no pity, only a deep, unreadable stillness. He gave a curt nod and motioned for her to follow. He led her away from the imposing main house and toward the sprawling complex of corrals and barns. The air here was thick with the scent of hay, leather, and horse. The thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth was a constant percussive rhythm. Inside the largest stable, Ben handed her a curry comb and a brush, pointing toward a skittish bay mare. "Start with the neck," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges from disuse. "Long, steady strokes. Don't spook her." Kate approached the horse, her movements tentative. The mare tossed her head, its eyes rolling. She had worked with plow mules her whole life, but these were different creatures, high-strung and powerful. As she reached out, the horse shied away, bumping hard against the stall. Before Kate could react, Ben was there. He didn't touch her, but laid a hand on the mare's cheek, murmuring something in his own tongue. The words were soft, flowing like water over stones. The horse instantly grew calm, its ears flicking forward, its breathing evening out. It leaned into his touch, utterly trusting. Kate stared, astonished. "You speak to them." "They listen better than men," he said simply before turning back to his own work, mending a bridle. Her first days were a litany of small failures. Her hands, accustomed to a hoe and a laundry paddle, were clumsy with the intricate buckles of a saddle. She spilled a bucket of water, nearly tripping over a stray halter. Her palms blistered. Through it all, Ben was a constant, silent presence. He never mocked her. When she struggled to lift a heavy saddle, he would appear at her side, take the weight without a word, and place it on a lower rack for her. When she spilled the water, he simply took the bucket, poured half of it out, and handed it back. "2 trips are lighter than 1 was," all he said. His patience was unsettling. It felt like a quiet judgment, a measure of her endurance. She found herself both grateful for his help and resentful of her need for it. She had come here to be strong, to pay her family's debt with her own 2 hands. Instead, she felt like a child fumbling in a world where he moved with an ingrained, effortless competence. One afternoon, a spirited colt she was brushing nipped at her arm, not out of malice, but youthful energy. Startled, she jumped back, and the horse's hoof scraped her forearm, leaving a bright, bloody gash. She hissed in pain, clutching the wound. Ben was there in an instant. Before she could protest, he gently took her arm, inspecting the cut with a practiced eye. He pulled a strip of clean cloth from his pocket, and with deft, sure fingers bound the wound. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "It will scar," he said, his gaze focused on the knot he was tying. "I have other scars," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't mind one more." He looked up then, and for the first time, their eyes held for more than a passing moment. She saw something in their depths beyond stoicism, a flicker of shared understanding, a recognition of the marks, both visible and invisible, that hardship leaves on a person. He finished the knot and released her arm. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. He returned to his work as if nothing had happened, leaving Kate with the strange warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. That evening, as a storm gathered over the valley, the air grew thick and heavy. The wind, smelling of rain and electricity, howled through the eaves of the barns. Cain had sent Kate to help Ben secure the shutters on the main stable. She wrestled with a heavy wooden panel, the wind whipping her skirt and tearing at her hair. Ben appeared at her side, latching it with one swift, powerful motion. Just as he did, the sky tore open. Rain fell in a solid, deafening sheet. They ducked inside the barn together, breathless. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, their whinnies sharp with anxiety. Ben moved among them, his low, calm voice and steady hands, working a magic that soothed their fear. Kate followed, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. When the worst of the thunder had passed, they sat on a bench near the tack wall, the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof a constant companion. "I never cared for storms," Kate admitted, her voice small in the vast, shadowed space. Ben leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "A storm passes. The land remains." His certainty was like a rock in the tumult. My mother used to say that she found herself saying. She believed hard work would pay out in the end. She never counted on debts growing faster than corn. He glanced at her, and in the dim, storm-lit barn, she saw the shared truth of their lives reflected in his eyes, lost struggle, and the grim, unending fight for survival. He was an Apache on a white man's ranch, his own land stolen from under him. She was a debtor's daughter, her family's land held hostage by ink and paper. They were both prisoners here. He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low. "My mother sang during storms. She said the thunder was the heartbeat of the mountains. A reminder that we are small, but the world is strong." "What did she sing?" Kate asked softly. He hesitated, then began to speak a few lines in the Apache tongue. The syllables were deep and resonant, a language of the earth itself. Kate couldn't understand a single word, but the sound settled deep within her, calming the frantic rhythm of her own heart. It was a song of resilience, a prayer against the dark. When the rain finally eased to a gentle patter, Ben stood to check the main gate. He tested the latch, then looked back at her. "You did well today," he said quietly. She blinked, surprised. "I spilled water, got in your way, and nearly got trampled." Still, he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "You stayed." It was the most profound praise she had ever received. In that moment, something shifted between them. The invisible wall that separated the indebted white girl from the displaced Apache man began to crumble. They were no longer just two people bound to the will of Silas Cain. They were two souls who had found a moment of shelter together in the heart of a storm. For Ben, the change was just as unsettling. He had built his walls high and thick after Nolan's death, allowing no one in. His life was a silent testament to loss, a solitary vigil. But this girl, with her stubborn pride and her surprising resilience, had found a crack in his defenses. He saw the way Cain's eyes followed her, the proprietary hunger in his gaze, and a protective instinct Ben thought had died, with his family flared to life. He watched her from the shadows, a silent guardian she didn't know she had. He told himself it was only because he despised Cain that he would do the same for anyone the man sought to victimize. But when he saw her smile at a newborn foal, a flash of light in the gloom of the stables, he knew it was a lie. The girl with the weight of the world on her shoulders was beginning to feel like the only solid ground beneath his feet. Silas Cain ruled his empire not with a whip, but with a ledger and a smile. In the town of San Pedro, he was a pillar of the community. He had funded the new schoolhouse, donated a handsome sum for the church steeple, and held the mortgages of half the businesses on Main Street. He spoke of progress and prosperity, and men who owed him money were quick to agree. But on his ranch, his true nature was revealed in the quiet, suffocating pressure he exerted on everyone and everything. He didn't need to raise his voice. A cold look, a softly spoken word was enough to make his foreman flinch. His interest in Kate Carter was methodical. It began with small, seemingly benign gestures. He would appear in the kitchens while she was scrubbing floors, complimenting her diligence. He would pass her in the hall and comment on the color of her dress, his smile never quite reaching his cold, calculating eyes. He stood too close, his refined cologne, a cloying, invasive scent. Kate learned to make herself smaller, to keep her eyes downcast, and her answers short, hurrying away as quickly as politeness would allow. Ben saw it all. He said nothing, but a dangerous stillness grew in him. Every time Kane's shadow fell near Kate, Ben's hands would tighten on a rein or a hammer, the knuckles showing white beneath the skin. He began to find reasons to be near the main house. When Kate was working mending a fence post or reshoeing a horse in the farrier's shed, his senses on high alert. One evening, Kane summoned Kate to his study. The housekeeper delivered the message, her face impassive, but her eyes held a flicker of pity. A chill of foreboding settled over Kate as she smoothed her apron and walked the long, silent hall to his office. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. The room was a monument to Kane's ambition. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with leather-bound volumes on law, philosophy, and engineering. A large map of the valley was spread across a table marked with intricate lines and notations in Kane's precise script. Kane himself sat behind a massive oak desk, the silver head of his cane gleaming in the lamplight. "Please, Miss Carter, have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair. Kate remained standing. "You wish to see me, sir?" "I did." He steepled his fingers, observing her. "You are a remarkable worker. Efficient, quiet. A rare combination of virtues. Your presence has brought a certain order to my household. I aim to please, sir, to pay what is owed." "Ah, yes. The debt." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "A heavy burden for such young shoulders. Your mother's health, I hear, continues to decline. The doctor's bills, the tonics. It all adds up. It seems an insurmountable mountain, does it not?" Kate's blood ran cold. "We manage. But you shouldn't have to," Kane said softly. He rose from his chair and walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her. "I am a man who appreciates beauty and diligence. I am also a man who believes in equitable exchanges. Your father's debt could be erased. A single entry in my ledger. Your mother could have the finest doctor from Tucson. You could walk away from this life of servitude tomorrow." Her breath caught in her throat. She knew what was coming. "What is your price, Mr. Kane?" His lips curved into a smile that was all predator. "Your companionship. A single evening. A gesture of gratitude. Nothing more." The polite words were a thin veneer over a demand of brutal ugliness. "Sir, I came here to work off a debt with my hands," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "My father's honor is not for sale." She turned to leave, but he moved with surprising speed, his hand clamping down on her arm. His grip was like iron. "Your father's honor died with him in a dusty field," he hissed, the mask of civility gone, his breath smelling of whiskey. "I own his ledger. I own his land, and by extension, I own you. Do not mistake my generosity for weakness." Kate wrenched her arm free, stumbling back. "You own nothing of me." She ran for the door, but he grabbed her again, spinning her around and pulling her hard against his chest. The smell of him was suffocating. "You will learn your place," he snarled. A scream tore from Kate's throat, a raw, desperate cry for help. Ben had been checking a loose hinge on the kitchen door when he heard it. He didn't hesitate. The door to the main house flew open as he burst inside, moving with a speed and fury that was terrifying to behold. He cleared the hall in 3 long strides and kicked open the study door. The scene that met his eyes sent a bolt of pure, white-hot rage through him. Kate was struggling in Kane's grasp, her face a mask of terror. Kane's refined suit was disheveled, his face twisted with lust and anger. For a single frozen heartbeat, the world stopped. Then Ben moved. His fist connected with Kane's jaw with a sickening crack of bone. The larger man staggered back, crashing into his desk, surprise and pain warring on his face. Blood trickled from his lip. "You savage," Kane roared, grabbing for his heavy silver-headed cane. Ben's fist came again, a brutal, efficient blow that split the skin over Kane's eye. Kane crumpled, sagging against the desk, stunned and half-conscious. Ben stood over him, chest heaving, his entire being thrumming with a violence he hadn't unleashed in years. He raised his fist to strike again, to end it, to erase this man who defiled everything he touched. Ben knew Kate's voice cut through his rage. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please stop, it's enough." Her touch was an anchor in the storm. He looked at her, at the tears streaming down her pale face, at the terror in her eyes, and the killing rage receded, leaving a cold, hard clarity in its wake. He lowered his fist. "We have to go," she whispered, pulling at his sleeve. Now, he gave one last look at the groaning man on the floor. Then together, they fled the house, melting into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the Arizona night. They didn't know where they were going, only that they were leaving the prison of the Circle K behind them. They found refuge in the small, dilapidated cabin that had once been Kate's home. Her mother, her face etched with worry, listened as Kate recounted the night's events in a choked whisper. When the story was finished, the old woman reached out a frail hand and placed it on Ben's arm. "You did right to answer her call," she said, her voice thin but resolute. "A man who stands by when evil is done is a partner to it." By morning, Kane's version of the story had already poisoned the town. He stood on the courthouse steps, a picture of wounded dignity, his face bruised and bandaged. The sheriff, a man named Bram Rowe, whose pockets were lined with Kane's silver, pinned a notice to the public board. "Wanted for violent assault and theft." The Apache hand known as Ben and the servant girl, Kate Carter. "A reward is offered for their capture." The lie spread like a contagion. In the Mercantile, it was said Ben had tried to rob the office and had taken the girl hostage. At the saloon, the story grew to an armed uprising with Apache warriors waiting in the hills. The town, indebted to Kane and steeped in a generation of fear and prejudice, was eager to believe the worst. Ben was an Apache. His guilt was assumed. Kate was a debtor's daughter. Her complicity was a foregone conclusion. The weight of the town's judgment fell on them like a physical blow. When Kate risked a trip into town for medicine for her mother, the boardwalk fell silent. Women pulled their children close. The blacksmith, a man named Jedediah, a cynical but decent soul who had known her father, watched her with weary eyes from his forge. "Best lay low, Katie," he muttered as she passed. "This town's got a fever, and Kane's the one stoking the flames." That evening, Kate pulled her father's old trunk from beneath her mother's bed. From a hidden compartment in the bottom, she retrieved a small, cracked leather ledger. "Papa kept his own records," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. She laid it on the table. He swore Kane was cheating him. He said the numbers didn't add up. Ben lit a lamp, its golden light pushing back the shadows. He opened the ledger. The early pages showed her father's neat, steady hand, recording every payment made against the original loan. But halfway through, the entries became frantic. The interest rates inexplicably doubled. Additional fees for land surveying and legal counsel appeared amounts that were staggering. Besides several of the most fraudulent entries were a set of initials BR, Bram Rowe. Ben said, his voice flat. "The sheriff, so the law is in his pocket too." Kate breathed, the full scope of the conspiracy settling upon her. She discovered another set of her father's notes tucked into the back of the ledger. They were frantic, almost paranoid scribblings about Kane's true interests. He doesn't want the ranch, one note read. He wants the border, the line that touches the reservation lands. Why what is on that worthless rock? Suddenly, it clicked into place. She remembered the map in Kane's study, the strange lines he had drawn. It wasn't about their small plot of land. Kane was systematically acquiring every property that bordered a specific barren stretch of Apache territory. The question was no longer just about their debt. It was about a much larger, more sinister plan. Their investigation had just begun, but they were no longer just victims. They were hunters seeking a truth that was far more dangerous than a simple forged ledger. Just before sundown, 3 riders approached the cabin. It was Sheriff Rowe and 2 deputies. He reined in his horse, his face a mask of false civility. "Miss Carter Ben," he called out. "Mr. Kane is a forgiving man. He's willing to let this go if you turn yourselves in. Come to the courthouse tomorrow. Give a statement. The judge will sort it out." Kate stepped into the doorway, her father's ledger clutched tightly in her hands, hidden beneath her shawl. "We'll be there, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady. Rowe tipped his hat, but his eyes were chips of ice. They slid to Ben, who stood silently in the shadows behind her. "A word of advice, boy," the sheriff sneered. "Justice in this town has a way of coming down harder on your kind." He wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving them in a cloud of dust and thinly veiled threats. Kate closed the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He thinks we're walking into a trap." Ben took the ledger from her, his gaze intense. "Then we will bring a trap of our own." That night, as her mother slept fitfully, Kate and Ben worked by the light of a single lamp. They pored over the ledger and her father's notes, piecing together the puzzle of Kane's acquisitions. A pattern emerged, a crescent of ranches, all bought or seized through predatory loans, forming a perfect barrier around the northern edge of the Apache lands. "He is building a wall," Ben said, tracing the line on a crude map Kate had drawn. "But is he trying to keep something out or lock something in?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unanswered. They were no longer fighting for one small ranch. They were fighting for the truth of the entire valley. The day of the hearing dawned pale and brittle. San Pedro's main street was crowded, a gallery of expectant faces, waiting for the drama to unfold. Kate walked beside her mother, who leaned heavily on her arm, her breathing a painful, shallow whisper. Ben walked a pace behind them, his face impassive, but his eyes were constantly moving, scanning the rooftops, the alleyways, the faces in the crowd. He carried her father's ledger wrapped in oilskin. Sheriff Rowe and Silas Kane were waiting on the courthouse steps. Kane's face was a carefully constructed mask of wronged virtue, the bruises adding a touch of theatrical sympathy. Miss Carter Kane said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And my former hand. How brave of you to appear. Perhaps a quick confession will spare you the worst of the court's judgment." "The only thing I have to confess, Mr. Kane," Kate replied, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself, "is that I was a fool to ever trust you." Inside, the courtroom was packed. The justice of the peace, a man who owed his position to Kane's influence, listened with a solemn nod as Kane recounted his fabricated tale of assault and betrayal. He spoke of Ben's savage nature and Kate's misguided loyalties, painting them as villains in a story of his own making. When he finished, a murmur of assent rippled through the room. But then Kate rose. She did not speak of the attack in the study. She knew that would become her word against his, a battle she couldn't win. Instead, she opened her father's ledger. In a voice that grew stronger with every word, she laid out the evidence of Kane's financial crimes, the inflated interest, the fraudulent fees, the systematic bleeding of her family's livelihood. She pointed to the initials of Sheriff Bram Rowe, a clear sign of collusion. "This isn't just about my father," she declared, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of other ranchers and merchants she knew were also in Kane's debt. "This is about every family in this valley, whose signature is in Mr. Kane's ledger." He isn't building a ranch. He is building a kingdom on a throne of lies. A gasp went through the crowd. Rowe shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is forgery slander. Ben's voice cut through the uproar, low and powerful. There are other ledgers, other families. Their numbers will tell the same story. Before the justice could restore order, a shout came from outside, followed by the thunder of hooves. 3 of Kane's hired guns, the same ruthless men from the stagecoach robbery, rode into the square, rifles raised. They fired into the air, scattering the crowd in a wave of panic. Kane had not come for justice. He had come for a verdict delivered by bullets. Chaos erupted. Ben moved with lightning speed, shoving Kate and her mother toward a back room. "Stay down," he commanded. He slipped out a side door, melting into the warren of corrals behind the courthouse. One of the gunmen stalked into the stables, his rifle sweeping the shadows. Ben, hidden in the loft above, dropped a looped rawhide rope. It fell perfectly, tightening around the man's ankle. With a powerful heave, Ben jerked the rope, and the gunman was yanked off his feet, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the dirt. A second gunman rounded the corner. Ben had no time for subtlety. He launched himself from the loft, landing on the man's shoulders and driving him face first into a water trough. The fight was brutal and short. The third gunman had Ben cornered, his pistol leveled. Nowhere left to run, Apache, he sneered. Suddenly, a pitchfork tine jabbed hard into the man's side. He roared in pain, turning to see Kate standing there, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fury. The momentary distraction was all Ben needed. He lunged, disarming the man and slamming his head against a post. The square fell silent, and the only sounds the nervous stamping of horses and the ragged breathing of the fighters. And then a new sound emerged, the steady, disciplined tread of approaching riders. A tall man in a dusty long coat with a federal marshal's star pinned to his chest strode into the square, flanked by 4 deputies. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene. In an instant, the downed gunmen, Kane and Rowe, on the courthouse steps, and Ben and Kate standing defensively by the stables. "I am U.S. Marshal Briggs," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of indisputable authority. "I've been tracking a gang of stagecoach robbers. Their trail led me straight to this town and to a very interesting series of land purchases made by Mr. Silas Kane." He dismounted, walking directly toward Kane. One of his deputies retrieved the ledger from Kate. Briggs flipped through the pages, his expression grim. "It seems, Mr. Kane," the marshal said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that your brand of economic expansion involves robbery, extortion, and attempted murder. You and Sheriff Rowe are under arrest." Kane's composure finally shattered. "You can't prove anything. This is the word of a debtor and a savage against a respected citizen." Marshal Briggs held up a hand, and another deputy brought forth a man in handcuffs. It was one of the men who had been with Kane at the stagecoach robbery captured on the trail an hour before. His face was bruised, and his eyes were filled with fear. "This man has already given a full confession," Briggs stated. "In exchange for leniency, he's told us everything. About the robberies you staged to bankrupt travelers and devalue land. About the locket you stole from a passenger named Mrs. Albright. A locket you seemed particularly interested in." At the mention of the locket, Ben's entire body went rigid. He stepped forward. "The locket," he said, his voice rough. "What did it look like?" Briggs looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "Silver, chased with a flower design. A desert primrose, I believe my deputy said. The world tilted on its axis." It was true. It was Nolan's. 1,000 questions, all born of impossible grief, screamed in Ben's mind. How, why? But there was no time for answers. In the confusion, with all eyes on the marshal, Silas Kane made his move. He shoved Rowe into the deputies and bolted not for a horse, but for the nearby church. He disappeared inside, barring the heavy oak doors behind him. "He's not getting away," Briggs snarled, sending 2 deputies around the back. But as Ben stared at the church, A cold dread filled him. Kate's mother, weakened and terrified, had sought refuge in the church during the shootout. Cain wasn't just fleeing. He was taking a hostage. "Her mother is in there," Kate cried, her face ashen. Marshal Briggs swore. "He's barricaded himself in. We'll have to wait him out." "No," Ben said, his voice low and certain. "There is another way in. The old bell tower. I can get in from the roof." He looked at the marshal, and Briggs saw something in the Apache's eyes that went beyond the immediate crisis, a deep, personal stake that burned with a cold fire. This wasn't just about justice anymore. "Go," Briggs said, giving a curt nod. "End this." While the marshal's men created a diversion at the front, Ben scaled the wall at the back of the church, his fingers and toes finding purchase in the weathered adobe. He moved with the silence and grace of a mountain cat, a ghost against the stone. He slipped through the belfry window and descended into the shadowed loft, looking down into the nave of the church. Below, Silas Cain stood near the altar, a pistol pressed to the temple of Kate's mother. The old woman was weeping silently, her eyes closed in prayer. The air was thick with the smell of old wood beeswax and fear. A dust storm was gathering outside, the wind beginning to howl, rattling the stained glass windows and casting shifting, monstrous shadows across the room. "This changes nothing," Ben's voice echoed from the shadows above. Cain looked up, his face a mask of hate. "It changes everything, you filth. You think this is about land, about money. You are a fool." He dragged Kate's mother with him as he backed away from the altar, moving toward an old, abandoned mission tunnel, whose entrance was hidden behind a tapestry. "This is about a debt of blood, and you are going to pay it." With a final desperate shove, he pushed the old woman away and disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, the tapestry falling back into place behind him. Ben dropped from the loft landing silently on the stone floor. He rushed to the old woman, ensuring she was unharmed before turning his attention to the tunnel. He knew where it led, to the old abandoned mission on the ridge overlooking the valley, a place of ghosts and forgotten history. The final confrontation would not be in a courtroom or a town square. It would be in a ruin, with a dust storm raging where the ghosts of the past had finally come to claim their due. The wind was a physical force, a scouring, blinding gale that tore at the abandoned mission on the ridge. Dust, thick as smoke, swirled in choking clouds, reducing visibility to mere feet. The sky was a bruised, sickly yellow. Within the crumbling adobe walls of the old church, the storm's howl was the cry of 1,000 tormented souls. Ben emerged from the tunnel into the mission sanctuary. Silas Cain stood waiting for him by the collapsed altar, the silver locket dangling from his gloved fingers. The pistol in his other hand was steady. His face, illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning, was a terrifying visage of grief and madness. "I knew you would follow," Cain said, his voice rising to be heard over the wind. "A predator always returns to the place of the kill. That locket." Ben said, his own voice tight, ignoring the accusation. "Where did you get it?" Cain laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Where did I get it? It was a gift. To my wife, Eleanor. On the day our son was born." He held it up, letting it twist in the storm-charged air. "The fools on the stagecoach were an inconvenience. I was tracking this. It was sold to a jeweler in Tucson by a cavalry sergeant, a man who liked to boast of the spoils he took from a punitive action against some renegade Apaches 5 years ago." The pieces crashed into place in Ben's mind with the force of a physical blow. The raid, the lies, the locket. "That raid was a mistake," Ben said, his words raw. "The cavalry attacked my people, a peaceful camp. They killed women, children. They killed my wife." Cain roared, the facade of control finally cracking, revealing the abyss of pain beneath. "My son, they were traveling to meet me. Their wagon broke down, and they had taken shelter with what they thought was a friendly native family. But your people, your tribe, they raided the camp where my family lay sleeping. They slaughtered everyone. No, Ben whispered, shaking his head. That is a lie. It is the truth, Cain screamed, his eyes wild. I found their bodies myself. I found the tracks of unshod ponies leading away from the massacre. The official report called it an intertribal dispute. But I knew it was your people. And I swore on my wife's grave that I would burn your world to the ground. I bought the land around you, choked your resources, ruined your neighbors. All to draw you out. The man they said lived but was never seen. The ghost of the San Pedro Valley. I wanted you to suffer as I have suffered. To lose everything you held dear. The weight of Cain's mad grief-fueled vendetta was staggering. He had orchestrated the ruin of an entire valley, not for greed, but for a twisted, mistaken revenge. My wife was in that camp. Ben said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that matched Cain's. My son, they died that day too. Your wife's locket. It is identical to one that belonged to my Nalin. They were made by the same craftsman. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed Cain's face, but it was quickly extinguished by the fire of his hatred. Lies, the tricks of a savage tongue. He lunged not with a pistol, but with a knife he drew from his boot. The fight was a primal, desperate clash in the heart of the storm. It was not a battle of skill, but of raw, untethered rage and grief. They crashed through rotten pews, their grunts and curses swallowed by the wind. Dust filled their lungs, and the failing light made them little more than warring silhouettes. Ben was stronger, but Cain was fueled by a madness that gave him an unholy strength. As they grappled near a crumbling wall, Cain gasped out another detail, another piece of his poisoned truth. I remember the arrows he choked out, trying to drive his knife into Ben's side. They were fletched with crow feathers tied with red sinew. Just like the ones your tribe uses. Ben froze. The detail was so specific, so correct. Crow feathers and red sinew were the mark of his clan's arrows. But they had not made war in a generation. It made no sense. And then another memory surfaced, a fragment he had long suppressed. On the day of the raid, just before the cavalry descended, he had seen two strangers in the camp, men, dressed as Apache hunters, their faces painted in a way he did not recognize. They had vanished just as the soldiers appeared. It wasn't us, Ben realized the truth, hitting him with the force of a revelation. There were others there, men disguised as us. He looked at Cain, seeing not a monster, but another victim. Who else wanted that land? Who benefited from a war between the cavalry and the Apache? The question hung in the air. The answer was obvious, a third piece of the valley's corrupt puzzle, the land speculators backed by the railroad who had been trying for years to have the Apache reservation dissolved so they could claim the water rights to the San Pedro River. Starting a war would have been the quickest way to achieve their goal. We were both lied to, Ben said, his voice filled with a sudden weary clarity. They used your family's death to start a fire. They used my family's death as the kindling. Cain stared at him, his chest heaving, the knife still in his hand. The entire foundation of his life, the grief that had driven him for 5 long years, was built on a lie. The realization broke him. A terrible guttural sob escaped his lips. The knife clattered to the floor. He sank to his knees, a man hollowed out by a phantom vengeance. The choice was Ben's. He could end it. He could kill the man who had tormented the valley, the man whose actions had led them to this ruin. It would be easy. It might even feel like justice. Instead, he looked down at the man, weeping in the dust, and saw only a reflection of his own pain. He saw a husband and a father whose world had been stolen by the same faceless evil. To kill him would not be justice. It would only be completing the circle of violence that others had drawn. Ben backed away slowly. He would not take his revenge. He would let this broken man face a different kind of justice, the kind that came with living with the truth. As if on cue, the mission door burst open, and Marshal Briggs stood there, flanked by Kate, who had refused to be left behind. They saw the scene before them, Cain on his knees broken, and Ben standing over him, his hands empty. The storm outside began to recede, its fury spent. A pale, watery light began to filter through the dust-choked air. The war was over. In the quiet that followed the storm, the truth settled over San Pedro like a slow, cleansing rain. Marshal Briggs, armed with the confessions of both Cain and the captured gunmen, began to unravel the web of corruption that had held the valley in its grip. The land speculators and their railroad partners in Tucson were named. Warrants were issued. The gears of a larger, more impartial justice began to turn. Silas Cain was taken into custody, a silent, hollowed-out man who offered no resistance. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by the dead ashes of a life consumed by a lie. The town watched his departure in stunned silence. The pillar of their community was a murderer. The savage was a victim. The world had been turned upside axle. A few days later, a small delegation of townsfolk led by the blacksmith Jedediah walked the dusty road to the Carter cabin. Ben was mending a fence post, and Kate was helping her mother tend a small herb garden. They stopped a respectful distance away, their hats in their hands. We came to say we were wrong. Jedediah said, his voice gruff with an emotion he wasn't used to showing. We listened to whispers instead of our own hearts. We're sorry. It wasn't a grand speech, but it was honest. Ben looked at the faces of the men and women who had scorned him, and he saw not malice, but the shame of people waking from a long, poisoned dream. He gave a single slow nod of acceptance. It was enough. The healing of the valley had begun. Marshal Briggs stayed for another week. Before he left, he sought out Ben. He held out a small oilskin pouch. This was found in Cain's possession, he said. Inside was the silver locket with the primrose design. His wife's, I presume. Evidence, technically. But I think its story has been told. Ben took it. The silver was cold in his palm. Later that day, he walked alone to the small secluded grove of cottonwoods, where he had buried Nalan and his son 5 years before. From a leather pouch he wore around his neck, he took out another locket, a twin to the one in his hand. His own Nalan's locket, the one he had believed lost forever, had been returned to him by a soldier racked with guilt years ago. He had kept its existence a secret, a private piece of his grief. Now he held the 2 lockets, one for each lost wife, 2 identical symbols of 2 stolen lives. They were emblems of a shared tragedy born from the same lie. He knelt and with his bare hands dug a small hole in the earth at the base of the largest cottonwood. He placed both lockets inside their silver chains, tangling together. He did not say a prayer. He did not weep. He simply covered them with earth, burying the pain and the hatred and the cycle of vengeance with them. It was not an act of forgetting, but an act of forgiveness for Cain, for the soldiers, and for himself. He stood up and saw Kate approaching her steps, quiet on the soft earth. She had watched him from a distance, giving him his space. She came to his side now and slipped her hand into his. She didn't ask what he had done. She didn't need to. She understood. They stood together under the cottonwood tree, looking out over the valley. The air was clean-washed by the storm. The sun was setting, painting the mesas in hues of lavender and rose. The land remained scarred, but resilient, ready for a new season. The ghosts of the past were finally at peace. And for the first time, Ben and Kate could see a future stretching before them, a future they would build together, not on a foundation of debt and sorrow, but on the solid ground of a love that had been forged in fire and tempered by truth.